ladies and gentlemen, prepare for a treat this evening. So a friend, Jorge, is a university professor of international relations and negotiation and director of the Masters in International Leadership and Negotiation at the Universidad Europea of Valencia, which is in collaboration with UNITAR, the UN agency based in Spain. He has well over a decade of teaching experience, and he specializes in diplomacy, conflict resolution, and high-stakes negotiations, particularly in the post-Soviet space, a very interesting area. He previously worked as a senior political advisor at the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe, where he was involved in many multilateral dialogue and institutional negotiation processes. So he got a lot of experience, which is we're looking forward to hearing about. But tonight, he is the creator of a negotiation system, which is called Prometheus. And he's going to take us through this, but he's going to relate it to the current problems with Iran and the US. So, Jorge, it's a huge pleasure and privilege to have you with us. We really are privileged to have you here. And we really look forward to hearing what you have to say, my friend.
Well, thank you, Ian, very much for having me here today. And buenas tardes, buenos días, buenas noches to everyone. And well, I don't know if we can start from now, or we need to wait for a couple of minutes. What do you think?
No, well, I think we can start because we only have an hour and it's such a fascinating topic.
Good.
I'm sure
So,
people want to be part of it. So we'll just hand over to
can I
you.
share my own presentation?
Yes, please.
Okay, good. 1 second. Can you watch it?
Yes.
Okay, very good. Well, once again, good afternoon, and thank you for being here. Let me start with a simple idea. This is not a talk about war. It's talk about how people negotiate when the stakes are at their highest. Because when we look at conflicts like this, Iran, we tend to think they are exceptional, different, unique, but they aren't. They simply expose in a much more visible way the same mistakes people make every day in business, in leadership, and in their own careers. And that is the real focus of today's session. Not politics, not ideology, but structure. Because the difference between a good and a bad negotiation is, in my opinion, rarely about intelligence or even power. It is about how you think through the process, right? And that is what we are going to explore today. A structured way to understand negotiation through 4 key elements: power, time, alternatives, and decision making. Let me, okay, now, well, let's go one step further, because here is the paradox. Most people actually know the tools. They have heard about BATNA, they talk about interest, they understand concepts like pressure or ZOPA. These ideas are not new. They are taught in business schools, in masters, in executive programs, even in short courses. So the problem is not a lack, in my opinion, of knowledge. The problem is something else. When people enter a real negotiation, they don't know when to use each concept, how to connect them, or what matters most in that specific moment. In some extent, everything becomes mixed, disconnected, and that is where they lose control. So let me say it very clearly. The problem is not that people lack techniques. The problem is that they lack a system. a structure that tells them where they are, what to focus on, and, for example, how to move forward. Now let's simplify negotiation to its core, because if you don't understand power, you don't understand negotiation. And here is, in my view, the key idea. Power is not one thing. It's the combination of three elements. First, your alternatives, what we usually call BATNA. If you can walk away, you have power. If you cannot, you don't. Second, time. And this is where most people make a fundamental mistake. They treat time as just another variable, but it isn't. Time defines pressure. It determines who moves and who waits. And in many negotiations, the side that controls time controls the outcome. And third, credibility. What you say only matters if the other side believes it. If your threats are not credible, if your commitments are not reliable, you lose influence immediately. So when you combine these three elements, alternatives, time, and credibility, you start to understand real power. And this leads to a critical insight. Time is not a data point. It is the, let's say, the axis of power. And you can, So once we understand power, we need a structure. And this is the structure, 4 phases. Every negotiation goes through them, whether you see it or not. Let's go one by one, because this is the Prometheus system that we have created is based on them. First, exploration. This is where you map the board. Who are the actors? What do they want? What constraints exist? Most people skip this phase, and that is their first mistake. Because if you don't understand the situations, you are not negotiating. You are guessing, right? Second, positioning. This is where you define your stance, your BATNA, your range, your narrative. This happens before the negotiation starts. If you enter the room without a defined position, you are already reacting. Third, development. This is the real negotiation. Exchange, alternatives, adjustments. This is where most people think negotiation happens. But by the time you reach this phase, most of the outcome is already safe. And finally, a resolution. Closing the deal, the agreement, validation, guarantees. And here is the critical rule. Never rush this phase, because if everything before is weak, the agreement will also be weak. So the system, as you can see, is simple, but very powerful. You don't negotiate randomly. You move through 4 phases: exploration, positioning, development, and resolution. So now let's move from theory to reality, because everything we've discussed so far only matters if we can see it in action. Let's look at the recent case of the Iran's war, the interaction between the United States and Iran over the past month. a situation where power is not the problem. The United States has military power, economic power, political influence. So, in theory, this should be a strong negotiating position. And yet, the question is this: what happens? What happens when maximum power meets zero structure? Because that is the real issue here. Not capability, but how that capability is used within a negotiation process. And what we are going to see next is how even very strong actors can weaken their own position simply by negotiating, without a structure. Let's translate everything we've discussed into a practical tool. This is what I call the Prometheus clock. It combines two key variables, your BATNA and time pressure, right? And depending on how those two interact, your position changes completely. If you have, for example, a strong BATNA and low pressure, you are in the best possible. Oh, sorry. Second, something was moved. The light, but I think everything is clear, right? Yeah. So I say that, okay, that if you have a strong BATNA and low pressure, you are in the best possible position. You control the pace. You decide when to move. You can afford patience. If your BATNA is strong, but pressure is high, you can still act decisively. Your alternatives protect you, but you need to move with clarity and precision. Now look at the other side. If your BATNA is weak and pressure is low, you are in a fragile position. You shouldn't rush. You need to build alternatives before engaging in a full way. And finally, the most dangerous quadrant, weak BATNA and high pressure. This is where most bad decisions happen. People concede too early, react emotionally, and lose control. And the key takeaways is simple. Your strategy should always depend on where you are on this clock. Not all negotiations require the same behavior, of course. A structure means knowing when to act and when not to, right? So, okay. Now let's look at what actually happened in the past 1 month and a half between the US and Iran. As you remember, this situation, the war started on February the 28th, when the conflict escalated following coordinated attacks involving Iran, Israel, and the US. From that moment, the United States entered the situation with a clear objective: to force the escalation quickly and ideally impose conditions through pressure in 3 weeks. So, in theory, this was a position of strength. But now look at the sequence, right? 3 ultimatums were issued in just 3 weeks in March, each one more extreme than the previous one. That may look like strength, but structurally it signals escalation without control. Then 3 deadlines were extended, and every time the American president extended a deadline, he transferred leverage to the other side, to the Iranian government. Because when you are showing that your time is flexible and theirs not, so then comes the timing. a ceasefire announced minutes before the deadline. So that is not control of time, really. That is reacting to pressure. And what was the result? As you remember, zero core objectives achieved. The key issues remain unresolved. So again, this wasn't about lack of power. It was about lack of a structure, in my opinion. Okay? So now let's map what we have seen using the Prometheus system structure. And this is where everything becomes very clear. For example, in the first phase, exploration, the initial diagnosis was flawed. The US misread its own BATNA and overestimated its leverage. And at the same time, the US underestimated Iran's tolerance for pressure and its control over a critical asset, the Hormuz Strait. So the negotiation started from a miscalibrated reality. Okay. Second, positioning. Credibility was lost very, very early. 3 ultimatums were issued and then extended. Every extension sent a signal. Your threats are not binding. And once credibility is weakened, power erodes quickly. Third, about development. This is where negotiation should happen. But here we see the absence of a structure, no real alternatives, contradictory messages, allies not fully aligned or even informed, and without intermediate options, there is no space for movement. And about resolution, the process moves too quickly toward closure. So what we get in is not an agreement, but a pause without guarantees, without a full alignment, and without resolving the core issues. So when you look at all 4 phases together, the pattern is very clear. Failure is not random. It is structural. So now let's take a step back and look at the full picture, because this is where the logic of the system becomes undeniable. At the start of the process, the United States clearly holds the advantage: a strong BATNA, military capability, economic leverage, global influence. In traditional terms, this should translate into dominance at the negotiation table. But here is where structure matters, because power is not static. It evolves over time, depending on how it is used. And what we observe is a gradual erosion of that initial advantage. Deadlines are imposed, but then extended. Signals are sent, but then contradicted. And every time that happens, 2 things occur simultaneously. Credibility weakens and time pressure increase internally. So this combination is critical, because once credibility is the match, your threats lose value and your alternatives become less effective. So now look at the right side of your screen, Iran. They start from a structurally weaker position, limited options, high exposure, but instead of reacting, they absorb pressure. They don't rush. They maintain consistency in their position. And that has a compounding effect. Their BATNA improves relative to the situation. Their control of time strengthens, and their credibility remains intact. So what we see is a reversal. not because one side becomes stronger in absolute terms, but because the other side weakens itself structurally. Okay, and this leads to the key conclusion: power alone doesn't determine outcomes. The management of power does, because in the end, this was not decided by force, but by how each side navigated the negotiation process. So the question now is simple. If this is how negotiations fails, how should they be done thoroughly? Well, the answer is not more pressure, not stronger statements, and not faster decisions. In my opinion, the answer is structure. Let me walk you through it. First, exploration. Before acting, you need a correct diagnosis. What is your real BATNA? Not the one you assume, but the one you can actually execute. What is the other side's tolerance for pressure? What assets do they control? In this case, control of the strait was underestimated, and that distorted the entire negotiation from the start. Second, positioning. You define your range before entering the negotiation. What is your minimum acceptable outcome? What are your red lines? And most importantly, what are you willing to do if those lines are crossed? Because credibility is built on consistency. If you issue a deadline, it must be real. If you make a threat, it must be executable. Otherwise, you are weakening your own position. Third, development. This is where real negotiation happens, not through ultimatums, but through structured movement. You generate alternatives, you create intermediate steps, you open a space for a change, because without alternatives, there is no negotiation. There is only confrontation. And finally, resolution. You don't rush closure. You ensure that any agreement includes validation and guarantees. Otherwise, you are not solving the problem. You are postponing it. And this is the situation right now. So the difference is clear. Bad negotiations reacts. Structured negotiation anticipates. Bad negotiation escalates. Structured negotiation sequences decisions over time. And that is the essence of the Prometheus approach. Not more force, but better thinking, right? So let me, I am finishing, but let me be very clear about something. The goal here is not to reject existing frameworks. In fact, approaches like the Harvard model that you can see here have contributed enormously to how we understand negotiation today. Concepts like principal bargaining, BATNA, value creation are essential. But there is a limitation. As I told you before, these tools are often taught in isolation as separate concepts. And when people face a real negotiation, they struggle to connect them. They know the pieces, but they don't see the whole board. And that is the difference. This Prometheus approach doesn't replace these powerful ideas. It organizes them. It places BATNA in the temporal context. It treats ZOPA as something dynamic, not static. It defines power as the interaction between alternatives, time, and credibility. And most importantly, it gives you a structure to decide what matters at each moment. So the distinction is very simple. System as Harvard gives you the pieces. Prometheus gives you the board, right? So, and let me leave you 5 principles that I have been collecting in the last years. Not theory, rules. Rule number one, never threaten what you cannot execute, because the moment that you issue an ultimatum that is not enforceable, you are not projecting power, you are transferring credibility to the other side. Rule number two, map the ZOPA before entering the room. If you don't know the range where agreement is possible, you are not negotiating, you are improvising. Rule number three, every concession must have a price. Movement without a structure is weakness. Concessions must be conditional, sequential, and reciprocal, right? Never move alone. Rule number four, build your exit ramp before you need it. Time pressure will come. It always does. The question is whether you plan for it or whether it controls you. And finally, rule number five, silence or action, nothing in between. If you are not ready to act, don't escalate, because ambiguity destroys power. These are simple rules with, for example, that I can show you today after observing the process in Iran, but all of them require discipline, and that discipline is what separates structured negotiators from reactive ones. And so at this point, you might be thinking, okay, this is about geopolitics, high-level negotiations, government, wars, but it isn't, because the scale changed, but the structure doesn't. The same dynamics we have just analyzed appears in very different contexts. In diplomacy, of course, multilateral negotiations, sanctions, ceasefires, but also in business, mergers and acquisitions, complex deals, salary negotiations, where BATNA, time pressure, and credibility define outcomes every single day. In leadership, internal conflicts, crisis management, budget negotiations within organizations where decisions are rarely technical and almost always negotiated. And even in personal, of course, negotiations, partnerships, family business disputes, asymmetric relationship. So the question is not whether you negotiate or not. The question is whether you do it with a structure, because once you understand the system, you start seeing it everywhere, right? So, and let me close with one idea. Without a structure, power becomes noise. Not because power is irrelevant, but because without direction, it becomes inconsistent, unpredictable, and ultimately ineffective. What we have seen today is simple. Negotiation is not about having more tools. It's about knowing when to use them, how to combine them, and how to adapt them over time, right? That is what a structure provides. And that is what separates reactive negotiators from strategic ones. If there is one takeaway from today, it is this. You don't need more techniques. You need a system. And for those of you interested in going deeper into this approach, this is exactly the kind of thinking that I developed in the master in international leadership and negotiation at Universidad Europea in Spain and UNITAR, where I am working currently. But for now, thank you for your time, and I am at your disposal for any questions that you may have. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. The floor is open, and I see a hand, Shiva. You can just release your mic.
Thank you. First of all, thank you for this presentation. It was very insightful. I have a question now. Speaking about this specific conflict of US and Israel against Iran, it's a multi-level conflict. We have a war of media, we have psychological warfare, we have a lot of different aspects which enter into this conflict. Now, speaking of psychological warfare, which includes also a certain type of information, a partial information, misinformation, where does it cope with silence or action?
Well, so can you hear me, right? Okay, good. So I think that especially the Israel and the US had a great amount of information about the Iranian positions, especially of their main political leaders. That you remember, they were killed in the first days of the war. So I think they had a full amount of information about all of this, but I think they misread all the process. But so this is a kind of this is I don't want to speak about politics. I told you before, but I think that of course the same mistake that the US committed from the beginning were very similar to other conflicts like in the past, like Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, etc. You know, where they are planning about to attack a country, but don't think in the next weeks after the beginning of the conflict. So in that case, I think the position of Iran, of course, surprised me in many aspects. And but in any case, I think that they were psychologically much more intelligent than the US in their capabilities to negotiate, because I think that it is very interesting to see how a foe to the US are able to map the credibility or the lack of credibility of the American president with his threats. Of course, it is true that the Iranian command was, according to the news, was advised by Russia and Chinese officials. So, of course, there wasn't a lack of information in the case of the Iranian government. But according to your question about the lack or the amount of information in both sides, I think that, from the beginning, of course, the Iranian side was shocked, because if not, they wouldn't be killed all the main leaders, the main political leaders of the country in the same day. But of course, the American government wasn't able to read this conflict from the third and upcoming weeks. And so this was the real problem, because of course I think that the US has a lot of information about what is the situation in Iran. But the problem is that I have a better concept about the the capabilities as a negotiator of Mr. Trump, but I think that maybe before he entered in politics, he was a better negotiator than at the current time, because I think that he got confused between, as I told you before, negotiating and power. And okay, you can hold the power, but you can, if you move wrongly, of course, the power is not useful for your purposes. Thank you. More questions?
I was wondering if we look at how Trump proceeded pretty early on. I thought this is never gonna work out because of the sea issue, right? Hormuz, the blockage. Would there have been any idea you would have had to maybe improve the negotiation? That what Trump could have done differently instead of what he did?
So, as I was telling you before, I think one in my view, the first mistakes of Trump administrations were especially in the position and exploring phase of the negotiation process. So he entered directly in the development process of the negotiation. So it was a real mistake, and it was well, of course, taken advantage by the Iranian side, because well, it was seen very early how, for example, Europe, the American allies in Europe, especially, for example, countries such as Spain, Germany, France, etc., started to block the aerospace for the American military planes. So this was very important because, well, especially for the American, was especially costly to cross the Atlantic Ocean to cross and reach Iran. So secondly, they were using its military bases in England, but well, for the British government, it was a difficult position, because the British government now is under scrutiny in the public opinion, if you have read the news. And well, it was this conflict was against the majority of the public opinion, not only in England or Britain, especially in all over Europe. Okay, so I think these problems of in the exploration and the positioning phase was understood very soon by the Iranian side, right? So, and they saw that, okay, so we are able to block the Hormuz Strait, and after that, well, you have seen in many other conflicts, like, for example, Ukraine and others, when the American administration has said that, okay, we will end this conflict in the next 3 months, in the next 2 months, and of course was impossible to get it right. So, and well, I think now the lack of credibility for the American administration is a real problem, because I think that it was taken advantage by other big powers, like, for example, China. And well, okay, Russia could do it as well, but well, Russia is focused now on Ukraine. But of course, Russia knows that, well, the American credibility has weakened after the war in Iran, and well, they understand that okay, they can maintain the same level of conflict against and Ukraine and wait, because Putin government is not on a rush, because there is no free of the demonstration in Russia, etc. And well, this is an advantage for countries with governments with undemocratic governments. Okay, you don't need to worry about the public opinion. But on the contrary, if you are rallying a democratic country as the US, of course you need to. And this is the problem now of the popularity with Mr. Trump. There is, as you know, as you have read the news, well, he has many problems before the midterm elections in November, because its popularity is going down.
Muchas gracias.
De nada. Are there more questions?
Yeah, I have a question.
Yes, please.
Yeah, thank you so much for this session. And I was doing a bit Google search as well. I came across your paper, which is titled "Are These Formulas for Successful Diplomat Agreements?" or something like that. So I just wanted to ask, since you gave about mediation and negotiation today, the topic was based on that. So what are the key takeaways for diplomats to get out of the kind of mediation or negotiation techniques, which not techniques, basically what you have said, that you are making structures. So what key takeaways can diplomats take away from the structure, the system that you are developing? So I just wanted to know from your perspective on this.
Yes, of course. This, as I told you before, the Prometheus system was developed much later than I wrote this paper. So, but of course, the knowledge of this paper contributed to develop the system, and others experiences with my students, and also in multilateral negotiations in the Council of Europe, where, okay, I remember that sometimes, of course, if there is a lack, first of all, to negotiate, as you know, it is necessary a will to negotiate. Because if you want to confront the other side, it is impossible to the position of, of course, it's better to say, okay, I'm leaving the room. Because if not, if you are trying, to confront someone who really doesn't want to reach an agreement, it's much better for your credibility, for your position, and etc., to leave the table. So first of all, it's very important in my view to map the situations, because sometimes people say, okay, how, for example, I remember some books that or some articles name how Russians negotiate, or how Chinese people negotiate. Well, there are protocols, of course, there are educational rules and etc. But nowadays, I think everybody negotiates using the same, understanding their ZOPA, where they want to read, etc. But as I have highlighted before, it's very important to understand where you are and where the other side is as well, because in many times I think the negotiators are not able to understand it, and they think that, okay, I am they think that, okay, I hold the power because I am the US, so everything will be done according to my view, but it's not, you know. So I think first of all you should be humble and to go to the negotiation table, understanding, mapping the situation, etc. In my experience, for example, I was advising in the past to some of the parties involved in the Caucasian problem of Nagorno-Karabakh. You know, well, I am happy to see that, well, finally, the Armenian government and the Azerian one were able to reach a peaceful agreement, you know, but during many, many years, they were confronting all the time. So there is also a very important element like the educational, especially in diplomatic negotiations, to educate the people, educate the communities. You know, I remember, for example, and you can also remember after the Second World War, the division and the confrontation between the French population against the German ones were alive, but through educational process, nowadays the France and Germany are good friends. So this is a question for I can speak you also about personal experience. I was living in Ukraine for many years in the past, and well, Ukraine was a brother of Russia before the war started. 4 years ago. Well, initially the Crimea annexation started 12 years ago. So before of that, they were good friends. Of course, some nationalist movements had some bad experiences with Russian ones, etc. But well, they were small minorities. But nowadays the situation is crazy, because when I have been the 2 years ago in Ukraine, there is, you know, a sad spirit, a sad soul from the Ukrainian side towards Russia, and of course on the contrary as well. So many Russian people hate the former Ukrainian brothers. So this is, I think you are a diplomat, right? Are you a diplomat?
Not a diplomat. I am currently working with a dispute center. It's an international dispute center, so we get a lot of different cases of various nature.
Okay.
So yeah, I'm a professional mediator. Yeah.
Okay, good. So so I think the educational process of the population is especially important. Okay, because if not, you can get an agreement between, you know, political authorities, but if you are not able to do the other side, the conflict will be unresolved. Thank you for your question, Mr. Gould.
Thank you. Just want to clarify on one thing as well, just add to this. I'm really sorry. One more question that I would like to ask. Mr. Shiva has raised a very good point as well regarding misinformation, disinformation. I am currently working on a research as well, basically on post-truth and peacekeeping. So I just wanted to know that the environment that we are living right now in, it's a post-truth environment where unverifiable and sensational narratives are spread across the platforms of social media, and you do not differentiate between what is right and what is wrong, what is truth and what is false. So there's a very fine line, fine thread between these kind of information. So the kind of information that is circulating in our environment